Before hospitals, before anesthesia, and long before anyone washed their hands before surgery, babies were born by candlelight in small smoky cottages, guided only by the hands of women who knew life and death better than anyone else. These were the medieval midwives, healers, outcasts, and guardians of birth. Tonight, we'll step quietly into their world, where every breath, every prayer, and every drop of oil could mean the difference between life and loss. There is a sound to the Middle Ages that has been forgotten, the slow, careful hush of women's voices behind shuttered windows. The rhythm of breath and prayer that echoed softly in cottages and chambers when new life struggled to enter the world. Before there were hospitals, before the clean white walls and steady hum of machines, there were the hands of women calloused, calm, and steady in the candlelight. These were the midwives, the guardians of life at its most fragile moment. And their world was one of faith, instinct, and survival. If you imagine a small English village sometime in the 14th century, the night would be quiet except for the rain tapping softly against the thatch. Somewhere beyond the main street, past the church and the low wooden fences, a light flickers in one of the cottages. Inside, the midwife has been woken by the sound of knocking. It is urgent, polite but trembling, the kind of knock that carries the rhythm of panic. A voice young male calls from outside. "Please, mistress," she's begun. The pains have started. The midwife rises without hesitation. She has done this more times than she can count. There is no rush, only a practiced calm. She reaches for her wool cloak, her small satchel, the tools of her trade that hang from a peg by the door, linen cloths, a knife wrapped in leather, a small pot of oil, herbs in little pouches tied with twine, and a vial of holy water. Each object has its place, its purpose. There is no luxury in her life, but there is order. As she steps into the damp night, the path beneath her feet squelches with mud. The village smells of rain and smoke. A dog barks in the distance, then falls silent again. The midwife knows these roads, even in darkness. She has walked them through storms and frost, to cottages and manor houses, to strangers and to women she's known since childhood. Birth does not wait for daylight. When she enters the small cottage, the air is heavy with warmth and tension. The fire has burned low. The mother lies on a straw mattress near the hearth, face pale, hair damp with sweat. Her husband hovers uselessly in the doorway until the midwife gestures for him to leave. Birth is a women's space, and no man has any business in it unless invited. The midwife kneels beside the mother and speaks softly, her voice calm and rhythmic, as though she's reciting a prayer she knows by heart. She takes the woman's hand, feels her pulse, then places her other hand gently on the rounded swell of her stomach. The baby is moving. That's good. The midwife nods once, silently to herself, and sets to work. There are no instruments, no sterile gloves, or measured doses of medicine. What she has is experience, years of watching, listening, and learning from the women before her. She has been doing this long enough to know when a baby is turned the wrong way, when a mother's strength is failing, when the pains are too close together or too far apart. In her mind, she keeps a record of every birth she has seen, who survived, who didn't, and why. That knowledge is her textbook. Outside, the wind shifts, and the old wooden door creaks. Inside, the midwife moves like clockwork. She instructs the women who assist her neighbors, sisters, friends, to boil water, to warm the cloths, to keep the fire alive. It is a ritual as much as it is a practical task. The women whisper prayers as they work. Candles are lit in every corner, not only for light but for protection. In the Middle Ages, birth was seen as a crossing between worlds, a moment when the boundary between life and death grew thin. Evil spirits, people believed, might try to slip in through that invisible gap. The flame of the candle, steady and pure, was meant to ward them off. The midwife herself murmurs prayers under her breath. She is not a superstitious woman by her own reckoning, but in this room, everything sacred feels close at hand. She has seen too much loss to rely solely on her own skill. Sometimes, it feels as though her work is not hers at all, but something guided by forces beyond her understanding. As the hours pass, the cries grow louder, the air heavier. The midwife gives the mother a drink, a mixture of honey, water, and crushed herbs meant to restore her strength. She rubs oil across the woman's belly, her hands firm but gentle. Every few minutes, she listens, feels, waits. Birth has its own pace, and to rush it would be to invite disaster. Then, suddenly, there is a shift. The midwife's hands tighten slightly as she feels the change, the downward pressure, the body's signal that the moment is near. She leans close and whispers, "Breathe now, my dear, breathe." The candles flicker as if stirred by invisible breath. The mother cries out once, twice, and then, just as suddenly, there is another sound, a thin, wet gasp, followed by the soft wail of a newborn child. The tension breaks like a wave. The women exhale together. The midwife smiles, not in triumph but in relief. She cuts the cord with her small knife, ties it neatly, and wipes the baby's face with a piece of clean linen. The child's skin is red and wrinkled, its limbs curling instinctively toward warmth. She wraps it in cloth and places it against the mother's chest. There, in that tiny moment, the room changes. The air feels lighter. The midwife sits back on her heels and watches in silence. She has seen this hundreds of times, yet it never feels ordinary. In a world where death is common, life remains astonishing. The life of a medieval midwife was not an easy one. She was a woman who carried both respect and suspicion. The people of her village needed her, yet they feared her knowledge. She worked at the edge of medicine and mystery, where the natural met the divine. Midwives were among the few women in medieval Europe who held positions of authority. They were not educated in the formal sense, few could read or write, but they held a kind of practical wisdom that even priests and physicians could not easily dismiss. Their knowledge came from observation, from years of watching women give birth, from learning which herbs eased pain and which ones were dangerous. In England, France, and much of Europe, midwives were often approved by the church. They swore oaths before local priests to use no witchcraft or harmful charms, to baptize infants in emergencies, and to protect the sanctity of life. Yet the very act of attending birth, of wielding knowledge that men could not control, made them targets of suspicion. That it was a dangerous balance. If a baby died during delivery, or if a mother failed to recover, the midwife might be blamed. Neighbors could whisper that she had cursed the birth, that she had spoken dark words or angered God. In some places, midwives were even accused of witchcraft, a charge that could end their lives. Still, most people understood the truth. Without the midwife, no one survived long. She was the village's quiet guardian, moving from house to house in the dead of night, carrying with her the fragile thread that tied generations together. Her tools were simple but deeply symbolic. The knife she used to cut the cord was also used to prepare food, to carve wood, to cut bandages. The same knife that separated a baby from its mother was part of everyday life. Her herbs, sage, rue, rosemary, and yarrow grew in her garden beside onions and cabbages. She brewed tonics, poultices, and teas, each one measured not by exact quantities, but by memory. A good midwife had a reputation that spread for miles. People would walk for hours to fetch her when a birth began. She was trusted not just for her skill, but for her presence. In a time when pain was unavoidable and danger constant, calmness was its own kind of medicine. The birth itself was only part of her work. Afterward came the care, the mother's recovery, the baby's first feeding, the washing of linen, the quiet rituals of protection. It was common to place an iron object, like a small nail or pair of scissors, near the cradle to ward off evil spirits. A sprig of rosemary might be tied above the door. The midwife would stay until she was sure the baby was breathing well. and the mother could stand again. When she finally left, often at dawn, she carried with her the weight of exhaustion and the quiet satisfaction of having kept death at bay for one more night. Her payment might be a few coins, or a loaf of bread, or a promise of future help. Money mattered little. What mattered was trust. As Europe moved toward the Renaissance, the world around the midwife began to change. Universities grew, medicine advanced, and men began to enter the realm of childbirth. Physicians, armed with Latin and instruments, saw midwifery as a practice to be tamed, standardized, and controlled. In cities, male surgeon barbers began to attend births, especially for wealthy families. They claimed authority through study and tools, though most had far less experience than the midwives they displaced. Slowly, the art of birth moved from cottage to chamber, from hands to instruments, from instinct to science. And yet, in villages and rural towns, the old ways endured. Midwives continued their quiet work, attending births much as they always had, with cloth, water, herbs, and prayer. Their methods were not uniform. Each region had its own traditions. In Italy, women burned juniper and recited prayers to Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth. In Scandinavia, they hung iron keys above the bed to protect the mother from spirits. In England, the birthing room was called the lying-in chamber, a space sealed off from the world for days, sometimes weeks. The midwife's presence in these rooms was both practical and spiritual. She was not only helping to deliver a child, she was ensuring that the soul entered the world safely. In an age when infant mortality was high, baptism was crucial. If a baby seemed near death, the midwife herself could perform the rite, sprinkling water and whispering the sacred words that promised salvation. For many centuries, this was her divine responsibility, to guard both body and soul. By the late Middle Ages, written manuals began to appear, books for midwives, often written by men who had never attended a birth. One of the earliest, the Trotula, compiled in the 12th century, offered advice on women's health, fertility, and childbirth. It described herbs for easing labor and instructions for turning a breech baby. Some of its knowledge likely came from midwives themselves, though filtered through the hands of scholars. Despite the growing influence of formal medicine, midwives remained indispensable. In towns struck by plague or famine, they often served as healers when no physician would come. They prepared the dead for burial, tended the sick, and delivered children, even during the darkest years of Europe's history. In many ways, their story is one of quiet resistance. They preserved a world of feminine knowledge that stretched back to the dawn of civilization. The same skills that brought babies into medieval cottages had once been practiced in Roman villas, Egyptian temples, and tribal camps beneath open skies. Midwifery was one of humanity's oldest professions, older than surgery, older than pharmacy, older than most forms of medicine itself. Yet because it belonged to women, it was rarely recorded. If you open the records of medieval towns, you'll find midwives only at the edges of history. Their names in parish ledgers, mentioned in lawsuits, or scribbled in Latin beside baptisms and deaths. You might find a note like, Johanna, midwife, present at the birth of a son to Thomas the Miller, and then nothing more. Her life, her hundreds of births, her endless nights, all vanish between those lines. But through those small traces, you can still sense their world. You can imagine the smell of herbs drying by the fire, the creak of the door as another husband arrives in the night, the whispered prayer over a basin of warm water. You can see the midwife kneeling beside a frightened young woman, speaking softly, her hands steady even as the storm outside shakes the shutters. Her life was not one of comfort, but of purpose. She lived surrounded by the cycle of birth and death, witnessing both almost daily. Perhaps that gave her a sense of peace that few others had. She knew that life was fragile, that it came and went like the flicker of a candle, but she also knew that as long as she could light another, the world would continue. In time, midwifery would change again. By the 18th century, hospitals began to appear, and childbirth slowly moved into their care. Male doctors became the authorities, midwives were regulated, and their ancient role faded into the background. But even then, in small villages and quiet towns, the tradition endured. There were always women who still knew how to bring life into the world with nothing but their hands, their knowledge, and their faith. Today, when you walk through a modern maternity ward with its steady beeps and stainless steel, it can be hard to imagine that the same miracle once happened by the light of a single candle, in rooms no larger than a stable. But the lineage is unbroken. Every doctor, every nurse, every piece of modern medicine stands on the shoulders of those forgotten women who once knelt in the dark, whispering comfort and hope. So if you close your eyes and listen closely, perhaps you can still hear them, the midwives of the Middle Ages, walking through the night with their satchels of herbs, their soft prayers, and their steady courage. They are part of the long human story of care, of life, of persistence. They remind us that even in a world of fear and superstition, compassion endured. That even without science, there was knowledge. And that before hospitals and doctors and sterile rooms, humanity relied on the oldest and most powerful medicine of all, the gentle hands of another human being. And somewhere, perhaps in a village long forgotten, the candle still burns. Thank you for drifting through history with me tonight. If you found a bit of peace in this story, or if it helped you unwind and rest, I'm really glad you're here. There are so many quiet corners of the past still waiting to be explored together. If you'd like more calm stories like this one, don't forget to like this video, leave a small comment, and subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep. Your support helps keep these soft, sleepy histories alive. Until next time, rest well and dream in history. Good night.